started with a noise no one should have heard. A soft creak from the attic of a house that had been empty for 23 years. What investigators found above the ceiling would expose one of the most haunting missing persons cases in American history, and the devastating truth a family had buried alive. Ember Lane had always been quiet, a dead-end road tucked deep within the sleepy suburb of Woodhaven, Ohio. It was the kind of place where everyone knew one another. Lawns were trimmed, front porches were swept clean, and the sound of children laughing often echoed down the cul-de-sac. But there was one house that no one walked by without lowering their voice. 124 Ember Lane, the Carter house. It had stood empty since the spring of 1999. Weather-worn shutters sagged like tired eyelids. Ivy clawed up its brick siding. Windows were smudged with time and neglect. For over 2 decades, the property sat untouched, a rotting monument to something the neighborhood chose to forget. But memories, especially dark ones, have a way of lingering. The Carters had once been a normal family. Richard Carter was a retired Navy officer turned factory foreman. His wife Eloise stayed at home and sold Avon products part-time. They had 2 children, Lily, a quiet 14-year-old who wrote poetry and rarely made eye contact, and Mason, 17, a varsity football player with a bright future and a college scholarship on the way. Then, one April afternoon in 1999, the Carters vanished. No warning, no signs of a struggle, no goodbyes. The neighbors grew suspicious when the mail piled up. Calls went unanswered. Mason didn't show up to school, neither did Lily. After 5 days, police entered the home. They found the dinner table set for 4. Plates of untouched food were rotting, covered in mold and buzzing flies. The fridge was humming. The beds were made. The family car was still in the driveway. But the Carters were gone. No blood, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. Every closet, drawer and room had been checked. Even the attic had been opened. That's what the first report claimed. The investigation stretched on for months. Dogs were brought in. The backyard was excavated. Neighbors were questioned, and surveillance footage from the local gas station was reviewed over and over. Richard's finances were combed through. Eloise's social media was investigated. Nothing pointed to foul play, but nothing pointed to an escape either. It became one of Woodhaven's coldest cases. Eventually, the house was seized by the bank and left to rot until 2022. New owners, a young couple from out of town, bought the house, eager to renovate it. The plan was to flip it, turn the ghostly property into something profitable. On the second day of demolition, while pulling up old insulation and replacing the attic floorboards, the contractor, a man named Caleb Morris, heard a sound he couldn't explain. He described it later as a dry cough, followed by what he thought was a whisper. Thinking it was an animal, Caleb pulled out his flashlight and scanned the attic. That's when he saw it. A section of the wall near the chimney had been patched with plywood, painted over to match the boards, almost invisible to the casual eye. But it wasn't original. The nails were different, sloppy, rushed. Caleb tapped. It, hollow. He pried it loose. What he found behind the wall would stop the renovation and reopen the case that had haunted Woodhaven for 23 years. Behind the wall was a shallow crawl space, 3 feet deep and barely 5 feet across. Stuffed inside were skeletal remains. 2 full skeletons, side by side, arms still folded, covered by what looked like old quilts and floral bedding. The smell was long gone, but the tragedy hung heavy in the dust. He backed out, called the police, and the investigation that had once gone cold reignited with more questions than ever. Who were the remains? How did they get there? And why had no one found them in 1999 when the house was first searched? But the biggest question was the one no one wanted to ask. If those 2 bodies were found, where were the other 2? The coroner's report confirmed what many feared. The 2 skeletons discovered in the crawl space belonged to Richard and Eloise Carter. They had died from blunt force trauma, likely from a single heavy object, such as a hammer or pipe. The fractures on their skulls were consistent with repeated blows. From the angle and placement of the injuries, it appeared they had been struck while kneeling or lying down. But there were no defensive wounds, no signs they had fought back. This suggested 2 things. 1, they likely knew their attacker, and 2, they were possibly sleeping or subdued when it happened. There was no murder weapon found in the crawl space or the attic, and the quilts wrapped around their bodies were the same ones seen in photographs of their bedroom from the original 1999 case file. But perhaps most disturbingly, the plywood used to seal the crawl space matched the basement paneling. It had come from inside the house. Whoever committed the murders hadn't just hidden the bodies. They'd used materials from within the Carter home. They'd stayed long enough to clean, conceal, and blend the crime into the architecture of the attic. News of the discovery sent shockwaves through Woodhaven. The story made the local paper. Former detectives who had retired came forward, admitting that the attic had been searched in 1999, but only for signs of squatters or wildlife. The wall itself, it was never dismantled. They hadn't noticed the false paneling. Public outcry followed, but underneath the anger, a deeper unease settled over the town. If Richard and Eloise had been dead this whole time, where were their children? Mason and Lily Carter, 17 and 14 when they vanished. Now they would be in their late 30s, if they were still alive. With renewed interest in the case, the Cold Case Division of the State Police took over. A fresh set of forensic experts combed the attic for trace evidence. For the first time, new technology came into play. Touch, DNA swabs, luminol, 3D scene mapping. Small items were recovered behind insulation. A bracelet with Lily's initials and a broken watch that had belonged to Mason stopped at 2:43 a.m. Investigators began the process of re-interviewing every neighbor, teacher, coach, and relative from the Carter's life. One lead surfaced from an unlikely source. A retired teacher named Diane Calder, who had been Lily's English teacher during her freshman year. She remembered Lily vividly. She was quiet, but observant. Her writing was heavy. Dark themes, isolation, people dying and coming back. There was one poem I'll never forget. She called it The Girl Under the House. The detectives found a copy of the poem in school archives. And it was chilling, wasn't it? Described a girl who listened to her parents argue through the floorboards, who dreamed of vanishing into the walls, who knew of a hiding place no one would ever think to check. Though it couldn't be used as hard evidence, it added a disturbing layer to the timeline. Had Lily been fantasizing about disappearing? Or had she known what would happen? It wasn't long before suspicion turned toward Mason. As a strong, athletic 17-year-old with growing tension between himself and his father, Mason's profile suddenly shifted under the lens of modern criminal psychology. Richard, as police learned from old family friends, had been strict, militaristic. Physical punishment was common. One friend claimed Mason once showed up to school with a split lip and said, "It's just Dad's way of reminding me who's boss." At the time, it was brushed off as a joke, but in hindsight, it painted a darker picture. A new theory emerged, Mason snapped. Possibly defending himself or his sister. He killed his father. Eloise may have been a witness, or a victim as well. Lily, shocked and scared, helped him hide the bodies. Together, they sealed the crawl space, cleaned up, and ran. But that theory raised another disturbing possibility. If Mason had been the killer and Lily had gone with him, what happened to them afterward? Had they lived under new identities for decades, or had something far worse happened next? Investigators began running facial age progression models. Mason and Lily's photos were updated digitally and shared with national databases. They searched for aliases, school enrollment records, missing teen reports from 1999 onward. For a while, it seemed like they hit another dead end. Then came a breakthrough. DNA match, not from a suspect, but from a routine 23andMe ancestry test submitted by a 19-year-old college student in Oregon. Her DNA partially matched a known sample submitted from the Carter home. It was too close to be a coincidence. The student, Rachel Lennox, was flagged as a possible biological daughter of Mason Carter. Rachel had been adopted at birth. Her birth certificate listed unknown father. But with this new match, police knew they had found something important. Rachel was interviewed, and what she told police shifted the case again. She never knew her real parents. Her adoptive family told her she had been surrendered by a young mother who claimed her partner was no longer alive, and she needed to disappear. No names, no hospital records. The adoption had been private and facilitated through a church in Idaho. But what Rachel had kept from everyone, even her adoptive parents, was a letter she found hidden in her baby blanket when she turned 18. It was short, just 4 lines. "My name is Lily. If this ever finds you, I'm sorry. Your father protected us the only way he knew how. We never meant to disappear forever. Always remember, truth hides in the attic." She showed the letter to the detectives. It was in Lily Carter's handwriting. After 23 years, Lily had resurfaced, but not in person, only in ink. And she wasn't alone in her disappearance. Mason, it seemed, had lived long enough to father a child. But where had they gone after 1999? And why had they never come forward? Those answers would come next, and they would unravel everything the world thought it knew about the Carter family. The letter had changed everything. With the DNA match and Lily's handwriting confirmed, by forensic analysis, authorities now had a narrow window of time. Sometime in late 1999 or early 2000, Mason and Lily fled the house after their parents' deaths. They crossed state lines, possibly under assumed names, and eventually Lily gave birth in Idaho before placing her child for adoption. The problem? There were no records under their real names anywhere. No hospital entries, no driver's licenses, not even utility bills. It was as though they had lived entirely off the grid, or someone had helped them vanish. Detectives turned their attention to the church listed in the private adoption files. Grace Hill Chapel, located just outside Boise, though were met with resistance at first. The church had changed leadership in the early 2000s, and most paper records had either been lost or destroyed in a fire. But one volunteer, now in her late 70s, remembered something. A young girl, barely 18, who had come seeking shelter. One cold winter night, she gave her name as Lila Monroe. Her brother, she claimed, had died in a fire. She was alone, frightened and pregnant. She stayed in the church's basement for almost 4 weeks before a private adoption was arranged by a local couple. She was sweet, the woman said, but broken, always looking over her shoulder, said the past was following her like a shadow. The address she gave, a small rental cabin 2 miles outside of town. The cabin had long since changed hands, but the local sheriff remembered a neighbor's complaint from back then. Something about a young man digging in the snow late at night and burning trash that stank like chemicals. A warrant was issued. Behind the cabin, buried beneath layers of hardened soil and pine roots, a metal box was found, corroded but intact. Inside, wrapped in cloth and plastic, were 4 items. A photograph of Mason and Lilia's children with their parents behind them. A journal, partially burned, a wallet containing Richard Carter's ID, and a silver locket containing a single strand of hair. The journal provided the rest of the missing timeline. Mason had written it, mostly in brief, shaken entries. He came home drunk again, punched the wall, yelled at Lily. I told him to stop. He told me to shut up or get out. Mum is getting worse. Quiet all the time. I think she's scared of him now too. Tonight, something changed. I saw him go after Lily. I couldn't let him. I grabbed the fire poker. It happened so fast. Blood, silence. Then Mum screamed. I didn't want to hit her, I swear. But she was screaming, and I panicked. We wrapped them, cleaned. I told Lily we'd run. We'd start over. We're not killers. We were just trying to survive. It was raw, fragmented, but deeply human. These weren't cold-blooded murderers. They were scared, abused teenagers reacting to years of trauma and a single night of violence. The system had failed them long before they ever raised a hand, but Mason's entries became erratic toward the end. She's coughing a lot, won't eat. I think the baby is coming early. We're out of food. If something happens to me, I want her to be safe. The final entry was dated January 5th, 2000. Then, nothing. Search teams scoured the woods near the cabin. Within a week, they discovered skeletal remains buried in a shallow grave beneath a tree stump, partially wrapped in faded clothing. A rusted chain bracelet nearby read MC. Mason Carter had died there, alone, most likely from exposure or illness. No foul play was suspected. A young man who had committed the unthinkable, and then tried to shield his sister from the world's judgment. But that left one question. Where was Lily? Rachel's letter, her birth, the testimony from the church worker. All of it suggested Lily had been alive and well after Mason's death, but after the adoption, she was gone. Until a chance tip changed everything. A former trucker, now working as a janitor in Montana, called in after seeing a photo of Lily's age-progressed image on the news. He claimed he'd met someone who matched her description in 2003 at a rest stop in Idaho. She was working under the name Elena. Quiet, kind, always reading. They talked for hours over coffee. She mentioned having lost her brother and giving up a child. "I thought it was just a sad story," he said, "but now I think it was her." He remembered one detail. She said she was planning to go as far north as she could, where no one knew her. "Somewhere cold and quiet," she'd said, "where the past can't knock on the door." Investigators expanded their search to Canada, particularly in Yukon and Alberta. And finally, after nearly a year of combing through identity records, they found her, a woman living under the name Eleanor Kay, residing in a rural town just outside Whitehorse. She worked at a bookstore, lived alone, never married, no known relatives. When confronted, she didn't deny it. She invited them in, made tea. Her hands trembled. "I knew this day would come," she said. "It was never supposed to last this long." She confessed everything. The abuse, the fear, the blood, the attic, the escape, Mason's slow decline. The cold night he died wrapped in a blanket, whispering he was sorry. "I was 17, she said. "I didn't know how to survive. I just ran. I thought if I gave Rachel a chance at life, maybe one of us would be free." The authorities did not arrest her immediately. After weeks of deliberation, considering the trauma, the journal, the psychological reports, and the statute of limitations for certain charges, Lily Carter, now Eleanor Kay, was brought before a judge. The ruling? Voluntary manslaughter with time served. She would not serve prison time. Instead, she would be placed under supervised release, required to attend trauma counseling, and most importantly, allowed to reconnect with her daughter. For Rachel, the story was more than a tragedy. It was the reclaiming of a family history soaked in silence. But the town of Woodhaven would never forget. In the months that followed Lily Carter's confession, the media swarmed around the case. Headlines blared with phrases like "the family in the attic," "truth buried beneath floorboards," and "mother murderer survivor." Everyone wanted a piece of the mystery that had been sealed behind rotting wood and silent winters. But for Rachel, it wasn't a story. It was her life, fractured, rewritten, and suddenly too loud. She agreed to meet Lily. The moment was quiet. No cameras, no reporters. Just two women in a small room in a community center outside Missoula, Montana. A social worker sat in the corner, ready to intervene if needed. Rachel walked in slowly. Lily stood, tears already welling in her eyes, hands shaking like brittle leaves in the wind. "I don't know what I can say," she whispered. Rachel didn't speak for a moment. Then she sat down and looked into the face of the woman who had carried her into the world and then disappeared. "I don't want to hear excuses," Rachel said. "I want to hear the truth." And Lily told it. Everything. What Richard had done to her and Mason. How their mother retreated into silence and pain. The night it all shattered. Mason's last days. The feeling of cold snow under her feet as she walked, bleeding and alone, into the town where Rachel would be born. Rachel sat motionless, absorbing it all. "It doesn't make it okay," Lily said, "but it's what happened." Rachel's eyes filled not just with tears, but the weight of decades unspoken. "I hated you for leaving me," she said, "but I think I get it now." They met again and again. Over time, awkward conversations turned into tentative phone calls, then letters, then plans. Lily moved back to the States under supervision. She got a part-time job at a used bookstore and began attending group therapy sessions for survivors of domestic abuse. She kept her head low, avoided attention, and rebuilt her identity slowly, this time in daylight. Rachel visited often. Together, they returned to Woodhaven. Just once. The house had been sold years ago and left to decay. No one had lived there since the remains were discovered. Its windows were boarded up. The fence sagged. The trees had grown thick around it, like the forest itself wanted to hide what had happened there. They didn't go inside. They stood at the edge of the yard. Lily reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the locket, the one from Mason's box. She placed it on the gate. "He died trying to protect me," she said. "He deserved better." Rachel stood beside her. "He saved us both," she said, "in the only way he knew how." They left the town quietly, unnoticed, and the house, cloaked in wind and pine, stood as it always had, haunted not by ghosts but by silence. Years passed. Rachel became a journalist, ironically enough. She wrote stories that mattered, about resilience, forgotten cases, and broken systems. She never used her real name in her articles about her own past, but she wrote with a clarity that only survivors carry. Lily remained private. She gave a single interview to a non-profit focused on abuse victims, speaking anonymously. Her voice, raw and weathered, became a source of strength for women in shelters across the country. One winter night, Rachel sat in her apartment, scrolling through old files. She opened a folder titled Mason. Inside were photos, what few there were. One of a boy with sad eyes and a crooked smile. One of a burned journal page with his panicked looping scrawl. One of the snow-covered woods where they found his body. She lit a candle beside them, not for mourning, but remembrance, because justice, in the traditional sense, had come too late. But the truth had emerged, and that mattered. Across the country, in a quiet house with a cat and stacks of worn novels, Lily sat at her kitchen table. A photo of Mason rested on her shelf beside a tea-stained letter that read, "You did what you could. That's more than most." The story of Lily and Mason Carter ignited difficult conversations across the country about how abuse hides in plain sight, about the cracks in foster systems, about how justice and mercy are often strangers to each other. Legislation was introduced in their name, the Carter Protection Act, aimed at identifying signs of hidden domestic abuse in schools and healthcare systems more effectively. Rachel continued writing. She released a memoir under a pseudonym. It became a bestseller. Lily never read it. She didn't need to. She had lived it. And every morning she walked to work with a worn satchel over her shoulder, passing by children laughing, couples arguing, dogs barking, life in all its messy, chaotic beauty. No more attics, no more silence, only air and sun and a future reclaimed.